Hello, I'm Valerie Worthington, and I'm here today with Alex Kennedy. This is the seventh in a series of conversations that I am getting to have with friends and colleagues and teachers of mine from Brazilian Jiu Jitsu who also happen to do awesome things otherwise. And since none of us is able to train right now, I am reaching out to these friends and colleagues to talk to them about some of the other things that they are interested in and have a background in as a way for us to stay connected and also as a way for us to share information. So like I mentioned today, I get to chat with Alex Kennedy, who is a colleague, a black belt. And Alex, thanks for being here. You run a gym in New Jersey.
Yes, northern New Jersey in Roxbury. So it's close, maybe about 20 miles south. I'm sorry, 20 miles east of the Pennsylvania border on Route 80.
Fantastic. And I am hoping to come visit you once we are off the quarantine. But in the meantime, I would love that. And in the meantime, you have a really interesting and awesome background that includes years spent as a public school teacher and also a background in music. And so today, what we are going to talk about is your musical background and expertise. So the first thing I would love to ask you is if you can say a little bit about your musical background.
Sure. I grew up in a musical family. My non-professionally, my mother played piano, so there was always music in the house. My uncle was actually a opera singer who graduated from Curtis in Philly.
Wow. So what was that like? What was that like to have him around?
It was great. A lot of exposure to different types of music. I grew up playing saxophone, and then I switched to piano. So again, I was very, very ADHD, so I didn't like to practice. Eventually I dropped a lot of the instrument playing, and I did horribly in high school. I think I graduated out of a class of 250. I graduated 235. So after high school, my older son was born, and I needed to get back into school. So the one thing that I thought of was music. I'd been taking voice lessons at the time. I was singing for a heavy metal band. And so it just made sense that I would pursue a career in opera.
That makes perfect sense.
Perfect sense. So after I had gone to the community college for 2 years, then went to William Paterson for 3 years, but as an English major. And then I auditioned for Mannes College of Music, which is part of the New School in Manhattan. I was accepted. I was like one of 300 that was accepted, regardless of instrument. So they were accepting 300 for the new class. I was one. And then, I got my undergraduate in music from there, in opera performance.
That is super cool. And like we were just talking about, it makes perfect sense that you would go from singing in a heavy metal band to studying opera. And I'm curious about, first of all, what was the name of the heavy metal band? And second of all, what was your look? What did you look like when you were singing?
The name of the heavy metal band was Jesus Chrysler. Which I actually borrowed from, I think it was the name of a car in a comic book that I had read, and I thought this would just be a perfect band name. For me, it's the name comes first, and then you figure out the rest. And then my look was, at that point, it was, I would say, early to mid 90s. The grunge scene was coming around. I was a big Soundgarden fan, so I'm sure it was like leather jackets, flannel, black shorts, and Doc Martens.
Amazing. And one other question for you about your background before we transition into a couple other topics. What was that transition like from heavy metal to opera? I imagine that each of them is challenging in their own way, but are there any overlap?
Yeah, a lot when you're singing very high, like, as a metalhead, I think some of my icons are like Chris Cornell and Dio. Like they have very, very big, high voices, and it requires a lot of breath support. So, one of the reasons why I started taking voice lessons was to get into a band. And learning a lot of the technical aspects of singing really fascinated me. So I think that's one of the reasons that made me want to pursue classical music so I could learn how to be technical. Very much like, my fascination with jujitsu isn't the exercise or the athletic component, it's the technical component, like figuring out, why this works and how to apply that core concept to other techniques. So for me, like that was very, very fascinating, and that's the carryover for me for music into jiu-jitsu. Just really looking at that technical aspect of, this is what I want to do. How do I condition my body to do it?
That is fascinating, and I have spoken to other musicians who also train who say something similar. And another thing that they say that's very interesting to me is that there is no problem on their part, or they don't have a problem with repetition.
Right.
So if you want to do an audition, then you practice the same piece for 8 hours and
Right.
you do it over and over again. So practicing doing 100 reps of an armbar, that's a walk in the park compared to some of the things that you need to do to prepare musically.
Well, so it's very funny. I tell my students all the time that, the first time you do something, you suck at it. It just is what it is. There's nobody that can do something for this first time and excel. So it does, like, that mastery requires repetition. And it's really funny when I was at Manus, we had a floor devoted to practice rooms, and it's in the city, so everything's very cramped, small spaces. So when you practice, you can hear what other people are doing. And you had very different types of practicers. You had the people who practiced the things that they were very, very good at because they knew people were listening. And then you had people who practiced because, for me, I had a wife, I had a son, I had a very limited practice time. So it was, here's my chunk of time, this is my focus, this is what I need to get done. And I encourage my jujitsu students to take that same approach. If you're very, very good at an armbar from the guard, practice something else. You don't need practice on that. When you come to class, it's, this is where I want to get my repetitions today. This is what I'm learning. I saw this week. This is what I want to rep. And if there is something that I'm good at and it presents itself to me, I might ignore it in favor of getting a live rep on something that I need work on.
I love it. And I mean, for me, you've just confirmed what I believe, which is that jujitsu is analogies from jujitsu are applicable everywhere. So,
Oh,
and vice versa. So it sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like your involvement with music nowadays is more on the appreciation side. Is that fair to
yes.
say?
Yeah, I
So
have not like sung in a very long time. Um, Occasionally, I'll sing for a wedding if the person is very important to me and I don't feel too inconvenienced. but but yeah, more it's a lot of it's listening, talking. I like to, one of the things before my younger son Jackson was born, my wife and I would make it a point to try and take someone um, that we were friends with who had never been to an opera for bring them to their first opera.
you know what you're reminding me of is in the movie Moonstruck when the Nicolas Cage character takes the Cher character to an
Yeah, yeah,
opera.
yeah.
and just the opera just elicits that emotion from her.
Yeah.
So what is it about music that you think the reason that you and I had chatted with each other was the idea of how people can use music as a source of comfort
Hmm.
or a source of distraction or whatever you want to describe it. What's happening often nowadays is that you see these memes that say, you know, if you're not taking advantage of this time to get some things done, then you're lazy. When people are actually going through very profound traumas, they're having
Right.
lots of serious things happen to them, and maybe they just need a mental break. Maybe they just need something that's going to put them in a different emotional state for a little bit. So what are your thoughts about what music can do along those lines?
So I think that, again, with anything, it depends on how you want to approach it in that moment. So there might be times where I want to listen to something because I want to appreciate very, very technical things. So I'm listening for a specific reason, you know? And again, much like jujitsu, much like watching the UFC, watching football, watching sports, like I cannot watch football. I do not like watching football. And a big part of that is because I don't understand it. And I know that if I took the time to understand some of the nuance, I would appreciate it and enjoy it a lot more. And I think there's one side to classical and jazz music that if you learn a little bit about it, it enhances the appreciation for it. But then there's other things where, I'm listening for just an emotional release. Putting it on while I'm cooking dinner, and just one of my music teachers once said, and I don't know if it's true, but they said that there was a study done where music is the one thing that hits your subliminal mind before it hits your conscious mind, which is why when you're driving in a car and all of a sudden you know you're listening to the radio, you'll find yourself singing something without consciously trying to sing it. And so, like, I think that's a great way to use music as part of that, encouraging emotions subliminally.
And in your experience, were you able to just, was it that you kind of explored a variety of musical styles to find the ones that really spoke to you in those different ways? And I guess the reason I'm asking the question is, how could someone who is, a layperson who doesn't have a musical background the way you do, how can they find types of music that are likely to speak to them?
Well, look, I think we are from the generation where if we wanted music, we would have to go to Tower Records, buy some vinyl, come home, read the liner notes, put it on. So there was a process involved. And, I loved, for me, I worked at 14, I had an under the table job. And every week I'd spend my money. One week I'd spend it on music, one week I'd spend it on comic books. So, it hurt me to the depths of my soul when I bought something and I put it on and I'm like, oh, this stinks. You know? Now, with the age of iTunes, Amazon Music, YouTube, it's very, very easy to find music and it's super accessible. It's just knowing what to type in the search box.
That
So,
makes
so I think we're now we're at such a huge advantage where that comes.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm also reminded of Spotify, right? Where
Hmm.
you just, you do a search in Spotify, or I can't remember the names of the other ones, but there's the algorithm, right, that
Hmm.
helps you identify things that are similar to the song that you identified or the group
Right.
that you identified as
Right.
liking.
Oh, you might like this. And for me, again, like it also crosses into things like reading, where like I'll find an author that I like. and I'll read a book and I'll be like, oh, this is great, so let me buy another one. And then I read, and then like I might read where other authors that are influenced by them, or that they influence, or that they were influenced by, and then I'll read those authors. So it's very, very similar. So one of the great things about classical music and jazz is they're broken up by periods, and those periods are very, very distinct stylistically. So when you listen to a certain composer and you're like, oh, I like this, if you know what period they're from, now you have this wealth of stylistically similar music that you can listen to.
So you mentioned classical and jazz music, and you and I, before we chatted here, had talked about focusing on that as a kind of a focus for this conversation. And you had also mentioned the accessibility of music, and it occurs to me, without having done any research, but using myself as an N of one, that classical and jazz music tend to be less accessible to someone like me who doesn't have a formal music background, which was the reason that we had talked about you focusing on that. And so the next question that I have for you is, what is it about jazz and classical music, and you can talk about them in turn, what is it about them that that might appeal to someone like me, or that you think is worth investigating, even if you're someone who doesn't know anything about it?
So I think that the technical aspects of classical and jazz are very appealing to someone who has that analytic mindset, which after knowing you for a few years, I know that you're very analytical. So I think that like there's an appeal to that. It's pretty. Like it's pretty. I'll tell you a really great story. I was driving, my older son is 25, and when he was 5, I was driving him to school. He's in the car seat. It was snowing, and I had the overture of Mozart's The Magic Flute playing, and he said, "This is the perfect music for this day." You know, there was snow hanging off the trees. So I think it's just it's pretty. There's really like at its core, it's pretty. And there's very, very definite reasons technically why it's pretty, which again, if you want to go down that rabbit hole of understanding why music works the way it works and how composers and musicians manipulate it to make it work so it's beautiful, it's fascinating.
I love that too, and I'll say this even though I'm a writer, so I live and die by the written word. But there's something about some music that just sort of transcends
Hmm.
the written word, and it gets to aspects of the human experience, or just affects me in an emotional way, in a visceral way that words sometimes can't. So I will concede that, even as a writer.
So like one great example, so when you look for people that are listening, if they want to start exploring things a little deeper, like I'm not a music historian, so I'm not going to really take a deep dive, but classical music traditionally is broken into three main styles: Baroque, classical, and the Romantic period. And then after the Romantic period, you have like 20th century music, which I really love. It's an acquired taste. It's a lot of noise. If you listen to it for the first time, you're gonna be like, ugh, it's kind of like death metal, just very, 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 dissonant. Um, and understanding how that music progresses is very interesting. So, like one example I'd like to play, one of my favorite Baroque composers is, Bach, J.S. Bach, and his contemporaries were, Handel, Vivaldi. So a lot of that, right along that area. So Bach wrote fugues. He wrote very prolific. wrote orchestral music, wrote, quartets, a lot of organ. So this is a piano piece, or back then it would have been played on a harpsichord. But what's great about a fugue is there's a lot of math involved. So they start with a very, very small melody, a very, very small theme. And the purpose of a fugue is to have that theme replayed constantly as other musical material is layered on top of it. So I'd like to play an example of a fugue.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's great. Yeah.
So that's the theme, the bum 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 ba-da-dum bum bum bum. So a really fun game to play is, as you're listening, try and hear it as many times as you can. Okay, I'm not going to play the whole thing, but we'll play it so you can hear a few iterations of that theme. Can you hear it okay? I know it's
Yes, it's
okay.
and the sound quality is not terrific on my end, so but it sounds, I can definitely hear it.
Okay. Oh, let me start it again. So were you able to hear it a few times?
In different keys, right?
Right. In different registers, right? So yeah. It's amazing. So Bach wrote his, one of his iconic piano works is the Well-Tempered Clavier. It's in 2 books, and he writes a prelude and a fugue, one for every key, and there are 24 keys. So, and this one is a fugue in 4 parts. So without getting too nerdy, right? Essentially, you have your theme that has 3 other voices that have to work together with it. And it requires a lot of math because there are notes that do not like each other. So if you have one note, you have 2 other notes that really love each other. And so you have to make sure that those notes are in love, even though they're working independently against each other.
Alex, can you say again the name of the fugue so that people who want to can find it and listen to it on a better quality recording?
Yes. So this is the Well-Tempered Clavier. Clavier is a name for like a keyboard instrument.
So in German, it's the word for piano.
Yes.
So.
Wow. Ooh. I'm impressed.
I used to speak German, not very well, but I did. Yes. Oh yes. I just like to try to, look impressive. So.
Right.
So 2 things. One thing that's really interesting is you said that it's very mathematical, and as soon as you said that, I was reminded of a book called Gödel, Escher, Bach, which is by Doug Hostetter and is this huge tome, and it's been on my list to read for ages and ages, and I need to investigate it again. So speaking of being nerdy, and I'm just interested, I'm curious if other people I know have read that book. And then the other thing that occurs to me that is interesting for people who might want to nerd out is one of the things that I like to do is learn about the backstory of characters and historical figures. So that's another kind of fun angle to take, is to, just go and find out what Bach was like as a young.
Oh, yeah, and Bach had. Oh, so sorry. Bach, I forget the number, but it was in the mid to high 20s. He had like 20 some kids, a lot of whom became composers in their own right. And from my understanding, is I don't think he was a philanderer. I've never read anything about that. I might be wrong, But one of the interesting things about that time period is the way a musician made money was through patrons. So in the Renaissance, you would have had, the de Medicis hire artists and musicians to write music that glorified them. The churches hired musicians to glorify themselves. So, Bach primarily wrote music for the church. One of the very cool pieces that he wrote was his B minor Mass. And it goes through, it's great. It's like, very famous English Mass is Messiah, where you have Handel's Messiah, where you have the Alleluia chorus. So the Mass, it goes through the church liturgy. And one of the things that Bach did is he wrote the B minor Mass as an audition piece for a new church. So each part of that Mass was stylistically different. So he can essentially show, here, I can write this, I can write this, I can write this, and I can write this. So so those little things are very, very cool, especially when you listen to it and you notice, oh, that sounds different. Oh, this is why, because he's using this to audition for
And
this job.
all of a sudden in what, 10 or 15 minutes, I've become a little bit more of a discerning consumer of
There you
classical
go.
music. So it's easy if you know how.
Exactly. Well, another really cool thing with the quarantine is the Met Opera is holding, they're not live, they're pre-recorded, but entire opera performances. And
Wow.
opera is amazing. Like I did not like opera growing up. And then it was one of those things that once I started learning about it, it became more interesting. And the opera that they're running now is Così fan tutti. It's Mozart, and Mozart is amazing. He's heralded as, one of the greatest musical geniuses of all time. And again, what's fascinating about Mozart and what codifies his genius is at an early age, his father would take him around Europe to perform in the courts of nobility. And even though, geez, I should have looked this up before, but even though I believe he was born in Austria, even though he was born in Austria, he traveled to Italy to perform. So he was the one composer who, instead of mimicking an Italian style, he wrote operas as if he were Italian. So if you held it up against other Italian composers in that era, it was stylistically identical. And that was like one of the underappreciated parts of his genius. And so what the Met does, they do a great job. They've done a lot of modernization. So when you watch Così fan tutti, it takes place in Coney Island, this production. And I usually take, when I take somebody to an opera for the first time, I usually pick Mozart because it's super accessible. Nobody dies of consumption. There's not like, it's not, a lot of his comedies are hysterical. And Così fan tutti is very, very funny. It's about two gentlemen who are questioning whether or not their fiancés will be faithful to them. So they concoct a scheme to disguise themselves and try and seduce each other's fiance. So it's very, very similar to like a Three's Company episode. There's like a lot of zaniness that happens. And there's subtitles. The Met has also done a great job with performing a lot of, the Magic Flute, they perform in English. And again, the Magic Flute is fascinating because Mozart was a Freemason. And at that time, Freemasonry was outlawed by the Catholic Church. So The magic flute has a lot of Masonic code in it. There's actually a great book that was written, kind of like unearthing the Masonic themes in it. So again, it's like if you take a few minutes, and again, it's not very long, but if you take a few minutes to start looking into some things, it really enhances the enjoyment.
And you had said that in our generation, which is absolutely true, you had to go to Tower Records, or I grew up in Central Jersey, so we would go to the Princeton Record Exchange, right? And,
Yeah.
but now, if you were to do a search on Cosi fan tutti, you could probably find a link to the Met performance or the Met recording, in addition to a Wikipedia entry giving you the plot, in addition to I'm assuming the sheet music for. Yeah, so the point being that, like you said, there are a lot of ways to kind of come at this in order to appreciate the music itself. So would you recommend Cosi fan tutti as a first opera for people to start?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I haven't looked. So they're doing a different opera every day. I haven't looked to see what they're doing in the next coming days, but yeah, Cosi fan tutti. I've taken people to see it. Again, it's hysterical. There's a lot of mistaken identity. Like I said, it plays like an episode of Three's Company. So.
And those issues, right? They're timeless, right? Like everybody wants
Oh,
to
yeah.
know that their love is going to be true.
It was very cool. Mozart had so much, like the movie Amadeus was very misleading. So Mozart had so much pull that Beaumarchais wrote the Barber of Seville, the Marriage of Figaro, and the third one. Okay, so the Marriage of Figaro, Mozart wrote. He adapted he took the libretto, the words, and created an opera around it. And again, I'm really digging deep into my music history, so like I'm not an authority on this. This is what I remember, but I believe that it was outlawed because it portrayed nobility in a very negative light. Basically, the plot is you have a lord. Figaro is about to get married. He in the Barber of Seville, he meets his paramour. They get engaged. The Marriage of Figaro is the continuation, where the lord wants, I forget what it's called, but he can invoke a right to bed Figaro's fiance, and it was outlawed. The play by Beaumarchais was outlawed, but they allowed Mozart to create and perform the opera. And that is another one that is hysterical. Very, very funny. So again, a lot of what's very cool about Mozart as well is the interplay between the words and music. Like he doesn't use the music as secondary to the words or the words as secondary to the music. He's excellent at marrying the two beautifully, no pun intended.
So now I want to go and listen, but I also don't want to give jazz short shrift. Okay. So we had talked about jazz as well. Is there anything else you'd like to say on classical music before we do a little shift?
No. So in the Baroque, you have Bach, Handel, Vivaldi. Awesome. Check those out. In the classical period, you have Mozart is the big name. You could go through a lot of Mozart, never be unsatisfied. In the Romantic period is when things started to get very interesting because they started playing a lot with the notes that don't like each other, that make you feel uncomfortable and that make you feel tense. Where earlier it would be like ba, 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 ba. Notes don't like each other, now they do. Da, da, da. In the Romantic period, they start delaying that gratification of resolution. So I would recommend listening to like a lot of Beethoven, Like Schubert wrote like basically the pop songs of the time, Schubert, Chopin, Tchaikovsky, all of that stuff. So, those are some names that if you want to YouTube, listen to, I think people will enjoy it.
And then you can plug those into your Spotify and
Yes,
let the algorithm do its work.
exactly.
I like it. See, back in our day, we didn't have that, and we went uphill to school and back both ways. And I think you and we didn't even know each other, but we shared the same pair of shoes. And
Yeah, exactly. I think I had to carry, even though I think we went to different schools together.
I think so too. Okay, so let's talk about jazz a little bit. What is it about jazz that inspires emotion, a reaction? What in you?
So I think it's the same. I think that again with jazz, you have very, very defined periods, and the music within those periods are stylistically similar. So if you are listening to a jazz musician from that period, you know what to expect. Um, so I like that structure. And again, within those periods, musically, you have very, very similar song structures. And understanding what those structures are, when you listen to it, oh, okay, this is what's happening. Okay, here's where this is coming. It's why like pop music is so popular. It's like there's like when you listen to pop music, there's a formula. You know, like I can listen to a Britney Spears tune and a Miley Cyrus tune and have very similar expectations, and I'm not going to have those expectations deflated. So jazz is a little more complex, but you have those expectations, and the fun becomes how they are working their way out of those structures, only to come back in. It's like, one of my music theory professors said that music is like the Wizard of Oz. You start at home, you go away somewhere, and then in the last few minutes, you end up back home. So being able to listen for those things makes things a lot more enjoyable.
I love it. That's really cool. And what I like about that is that it sounds like that's a sort of striking a balance between um, uh, being true to the form or to the period, but also demonstrating your creativity within that
Right.
form.
And I like that, like creativity, like a lot of people, I think, in art, in writing, in music, look down at form, look down at the structure of a form, and they think that inhibits creativity. But I think the creativity happens when you are finding ways to break out of that form without abandoning the form. Like to me, that's like more creative than ignoring the form.
And I if you take poets, if you take some authors, um, they learned the quote unquote appropriate structure for writing
Hmm.
before they broke the rules. So
Right.
I would imagine that you have to there has to be a certain level of skill associated with being able to appreciate and to cleave to a form,
Right.
because that demonstrates that you know what you're doing.
Well, I could write a poem right now. It's gonna suck, but like because I don't have the understanding of how poems work and how to be able to manipulate the rules.
Right.
You
So
know,
within, yeah, go.
go ahead. I look at it as like, are you a Game of Thrones fan?
I've been known to watch a Red Wedding episode or two.
But like a Tyrion Lannister, like he knows the rules. And because he knows the rules so well, he's able to manipulate. And I find that very fascinating in whether it's music, art, like somebody that you look and it's like, wow, this is amazing, but I can still see the connection to the form in it.
That's really cool. So given the you said that there are different periods in jazz as well, and what are those periods called, and then who are some of the people to listen for in those periods?
Sure. So, ragtime is great. Like Scott Joplin is, ragtime is a really great bridge of ragtime is almost a classical form. And ragtime is a really great transition point between classical and jazz. It really does a great job bridging that gap. And again, like Scott Joplin, if you've ever watched The Sting with Paul Newman and Robert Redford, the ba da 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 ba da ba da ba da 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 ba da da ba da ba, that's very ragtimey. But everything is written out, so there's no room for improvisation. But it's very different from classical, but it's classical in those regards. And then from there, you had like your big band, like Duke Ellington. Oh man, I'm drawing a blank. Duke Ellington, Glenn Miller, Duke Ellington are the big band leaders of that area, and that was like pre and during World War II. And again, it was big orchestras. A lot was written down. Then from there, you started having a departure where it became more about playing with the style. So then you had bebop. Bebop, you had a lot of those big band players come out and start smaller ensembles. And, the two that come to mind were Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker. They often played together. And there was where, you had the way jazz became structured is you had a melody like we heard in the fugue, and then you would have room where the instrumentalist could improvise and basically create melodies that conformed to this harmonic structure underneath, totally at will. And you hear like a lot of these recordings are recorded live, so you'll hear mistakes. And what's great about bebop is it's not, and about, how it relates to life, it's not about the mistake, it's about how you recover from the mistake. And it's not about, like doing something wrong, it's about noticing the doors that get opened because you made that mistake. And that's another relationship to jiu-jitsu. Like I have I have a lot of students that, or I had a lot of students that were really afraid to tap. So, at a white belt level, they would sit in somebody's guard and clench, because they were afraid of making a mistake. And one of the things that I tell them is nobody's looking at you, nobody cares. Like the only person that cares is you. So throw Hail Marys, as long as you're not doing something that's going to hurt somebody. Like throw Hail Marys, make that mistake and see what happens. And lots of times that mistake will open other doors. Sometimes it doesn't. Then okay, that's not something I want to do again. So,
Well,
go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if it closes a door, then you know that you don't ever want to do something to close that door again.
Right, exactly. But, you might throw that Hail Mary, that might not work, but then you might see different avenues that you can take. And that was like a lot of what bebop was about. And what's cool about it is you started to see this rapid growth in the music because it wasn't written. It was, here are the chords, here's what I'm going to play underneath you, and you go crazy. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, oh well, it doesn't matter. Let's see if you land on your feet afterwards. So like from that part, I would say like Charlie Parker, like I'm a big fan of bebop. So Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Oscar Peterson, Sonny Rollins, John Coltrane. John Coltrane's amazing. Miles Davis, early in his career, was very big into bebop. There's a great story about John Coltrane. I'm sorry, I blanked. There's a great story about John Coltrane. John Coltrane, like a lot of those, he was a drug user, and he wanted to kick the habit. And so after gigs, again, I don't know how much of this is legend and how much of this is real, but after gigs, he would get off the stage, and while he was trying to quit cold turkey, his bandmates would start, using heroin and stuff, and he would lock himself in the room with his mother in order to quit cold turkey. And then again, it became like, as every time he'd get off the stage while his bandmates were using, he would practice. So, and then you'd hear stories on the other end of Charlie Parker. He was so naturally talented, he'd play a gig, pawn his saxophone for drug money, and then before the next gig, he'd rebuy it back. So there's actually Clint Eastwood directed, I don't know if he wrote it, but he directed a great movie called Bird about Charlie Parker's life. Very great to watch. Then after that, and it's the last one we'll go into, the period after that is cool jazz, not to be confused with smooth jazz, which is kind of like Kenny G and that stuff. But cool jazz, started with Miles Davis with his Birth of the Cool album. More melodic, and I would say, like, check out, Miles Davis, his cool jazz stuff. Stan Getz, saxophone player. Stan Getz did great albums with Antonio Carlos Jobim, who is a Brazilian who is known for his bossa nova stuff. It's what, like, if I ever am having a bad day, I throw that on, and I'm like, it's gonna be okay. So
I love it. I'm thinking now about so having had the chance to talk with you and to think about what I would do next, because there is so much available. And I'm thinking, so for me, I would rent Bird.
yeah.
I would watch the movie, and because for me, the way I want to come at a musical sound is by understanding the people who created it. So that for me is the perfect way to do it. But maybe someone else might want to search the Met and go for a Three's Company experience, or maybe who knows, maybe people have old records that they bought at Tower Records because there are. But I'm just mentioning this because we've talked about so much, and since we are kind of in quarantine, since we are in quarantine, I'm just always thinking about, okay, how can I take what we're talking about and bring it into my life? And so those are kind of some of the ways that I would do it. And I think when we stop talking, I'm gonna go look up Bird so I can see if I can watch it.
Another great avenue is just picking a name that right? Like, I would be hard pressed to find someone who has never heard of the name Mozart. And then, like, you could spend years and not listen through his entire catalog. So just start listening, and whether it's, symphonies, piano music, small ensemble stuff, or the operas, just listen, see if you like it. And then from there, see, okay, well, who is he connected to? What are some other composers that were in his time period that I might listen to? And then you might move, or, if it's Bach, listen to Bach, and then that might bring you to someone else. And then, that might bring you into another, period of music that you like. And then it's the same thing as jazz. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, one of the things you mentioned too is that you'll put on different types of music for when you're cooking, or right. I can imagine I like to have some background noise when I'm actually doing my actual job. And so those might be ways for people to incorporate music without having to make a big production of it, no
Right.
pun intended. So, or was it intended? But just those kinds of things where you are listening to a podcast, used to doing that at a certain time of day. Instead of that, throw on some music and see how you like it.
Right. Absolutely. And
So,
look, the purpose of music is for enjoyment. So, like, I'm not a snob. There's definitely things that I just don't like. It doesn't appeal to my ear. But then look, like, I'll play Spice Girls in the gym, or Miley Cyrus. Like there are things that I listen to that for some reason inexplicably make me feel like, man, I want to do jujitsu right now. There are things that make me want to go for a jog. There are things that make me want to, just sit and listen. There are things that I just want as background noise.
and so I imagine that most everybody has had those experiences already with certain types of music, and maybe this is an opportunity for people to just tack on some more options.
Sure, absolutely.
So what have we not talked about around music? I know we could talk for so much longer, but what have we not talked about around music and how it might help people feel a little bit of comfort in the time of quarantine that you think we should cover?
So I think like for me, I mentioned before, like I've got very bad ADHD. Like I'm all over the place. I have a hard time sitting still. So I'm forced to sit still now. So I want something to occupy my time. I want anything to occupy my time. So, like, if you've never been exposed to these things, like, sure, go ahead, like, watch, Bird. And then that might trigger that response to be like, oh, wow, he led a pretty interesting life. Let me listen to some of his music. Or you can do the opposite. You can listen to some of the music and be like, oh, wow, I want to learn more about his life. Maybe I'll read a book about him, one of his biographies. Um, as a way to engage yourself. You might want to spend the great thing about operas is they're incredibly long. So you can spend a lot of time depending on the opera. Mozart operas tend to be on the short side, and by short I mean like 3 hours, 3.5 hours. And what's great is you can make your own intermissions, when you're watching it online. So, but a great way to, spend time, listening to something new and having a new experience. I'm not one of these guys. I'm not one of these people that feel like, look, you're not smart if you don't like jazz. You're not smart if you don't like classical music, you know. But you might, if you listen to it and you're like, this isn't for me, awesome. If you listen to it and you're like, wow, I could really get into this, now you're adding a brand new experience into your life. And that is one of the most amazing things that you can do. Like have a brand new experience. Like it's cool to be a white belt at something in every point of your life. And it could be white belt in listening to classical music or a white belt listening to jazz. For me right now, I'm a white belt at listening to country music. I've always resigned myself that I will never listen to country music. And all of a sudden there's some country music that I'm like, oh, this is kind of cool. I could really get into this, And so listening and learning more about it, it's very cool. And then, like food, music is meant to be shared. So it's nice to be able to say, hey, like let's check this out. Let's go to Curtis and see one of their performances. What is the big, and you're in Philly, what's one of the big like music venues in Philly?
Oh, there's the Wells Fargo Center for really big concerts and stuff like that. There is the Kimmel Center for
Okay.
Performing Arts. So lots of places kind of
Yeah.
running big.
And it might be like, hey, like let's go check out the Kimmel Center. Oh, like there's a very very cool performance happening. I'm interested in this. Let's go check it out live. And it's great because classical music is I don't want to say it's on the decline, but like I know from my personal experience growing up, like opera, classical music, because I grew up like listening to punk rock and heavy metal, it was like, oh, that's for old people. Like, I don't want to listen to that. That's for old people. And now that I really love it, I would hate to start seeing a decline in popularity, because then you're going to see a decline in the performance of that music,
A
you know?
decline in availability, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we don't want that to happen. We want everybody to have access, because again, it's meant to be shared. It's meant to say, "Hey, let's go check this out." And then let's go to a dessert shop and, talk about it for a little bit and see what's cool. Like, that's one of the things that I'm definitely looking forward to, is going back to seeing, live music.
So I love the idea of being a white belt or just being a complete novice at something, and being able to sort of experience the kind of wonder that maybe you don't often get a chance to experience as an adult. I love the idea of music being something to be shared, and you also alluded to an answer to the last question I have for you, which is, what are you looking forward to doing once the quarantine is lifted?
I'm looking forward to teaching. Like, I really like, one of the reasons why I stopped performance is I wasn't passionate. And it's one of those things that, in order to excel and make a living, you have to be passionate enough to put in a lot of work and self-sacrifice. And it's a reason why, like, I hold like musicians of any type of musician in high regard, because there is a lot of self-sacrifice. There is a lot of, passion that goes into getting up and saying, okay, well, I have to lock myself in a room for a few hours and just practice, you know? And that's the stuff that when you see a concert, you don't see. You don't see the hours that went into getting at a level where you could play professionally. And I just didn't have that. But I do have a passion for teaching. I love to teach. And so for me, I can't wait to start teaching again, to start teaching jujitsu, and, having fun with my students, and, trying to figure out like what problems they're having and how to solve those problems. So that's number one. Number two, you know, I haven't, with having a small child at home, it's been hard to be able to go into the city and seeing music, but, I would love to start being able to do that again.
That
I didn't realize how much I missed it until it's unavailable.
Absolutely. And you also mentioned dessert, which of course is something that I'm a big fan of too. So you mentioned a dessert or dessert shop. So yeah, I hope that I can be included in at least one or two of those activities once we're all allowed to move around a little bit more. But
Absolutely. Have you ever been to the opera? Have you ever seen an opera live?
I have never seen an opera live.
Really? Okay, yes, we will make it, Risa and I, my wife, for those of you at home. Though, for the folks at home, Risa's my wife. We will take you to your first opera, and we can even do it in Philly. But we can go to the Met. Met has. I'm not trying to be like, East Coast, West Coast, but the Met Operas is unparalleled.
Oh, I'm from New Jersey, and we routinely claim things from the city. There's only one city, and it's New
Yes,
York City. So we
exactly.
routinely claim things from the city. So you are on. I would love to do that, and who knows, maybe we'll even get some interest from people who are watching this to come with us, and then we can.
Absolutely, we could do an interscholastic field trip.
I love it, and you had me at dessert, but you kept me at cozy fan tutti. So we'll do
That's
that.
actually, if we have time, it's a very, very funny story. That's actually how I met my wife.
Of course, we have time. Let's hear it.
Okay, so this just like shows what an incredible genius I am. So my wife and I, we rock climbed together, and there was like, I could sense kind of an interest, but I tend, even though like I'm outgoing on my face, you know, I tend to be very, very shy. And so having a background in music, I thought it would be great to have a rock climbing field trip to the opera. And essentially it was all a guise to get my wife's email address. So I got my wife's email address. I got everybody's email address. So I send my wife an email saying I'm putting together a CD of highlights so people can prepare, and if she would like one. So I met her at a Starbucks, gave it to her. She was the only one that I gave it to, which came out later. But, you know, that was like our first kind of date. And then, you know, we started dating, went to the opera. And then it was just such a great experience to see people who maybe had those preconceived notions of the opera, kind of having that be deflated a little bit, and to say, oh yeah, maybe this was pretty cool. Maybe I would go see another one.
I love it. And basically what you're saying is that another reason for music appreciation is because it can lead to love.
Absolutely.
I love
It's
it.
the language of love.
It's the language of love. So you're on. You and Risa and I will go see an opera when the quarantine is up, and anybody who's listening who wants to join us, you can come too.
Absolutely.
Alex Kennedy, thanks so much for talking with me. This was
You're very
amazing.
welcome.
We could talk for hours, I know, and maybe we can talk again about other kinds of music.
Absolutely. Maybe we can do an entire hour on the Spice Girls, which is one of my favorites.
You know, I'm not going to say no. I'm not going to say no, as long as at some point we could throw in, you know, you were talking about country music, and I have some positive opinions about some country music too.
Oh, tell me right now, tell me who I should listen to.
So I really love Jerry Jeff Walker.
Jerry Jeff Walker. I've never heard of him.
So he wrote, and I don't know if he actually like officially counts as country, but I'm gonna say he does. He wrote a song. He wrote Mr. Bojangles. Do you know that song?
Yeah.
So he wrote that song. He has collaborated with Jimmy Buffett, who I guess is probably like, you know, sometimes country light, but he's the main one. Is Jerry Jeff Walker. Although, does Emmylou Harris count? Because I love her too.
I think so. I think it's given that anyone who uses 3 names is a country music star. So I think Emmylou Harris.
So I've just given you 2. I've given you Jerry Jeff Walker and Emmylou Harris. So
awesome.
So there you go. Yes.
Thank you very much.
All right. We'll meet back here after you've had a chance to listen to them, and I've had a chance to listen to some classical and some jazz.
Yeah, that would actually be a lot of fun doing a follow-up.
Let's do it.
Where you listen to some things and then you tell me, you know, we can talk about it and see what your thoughts are.
I like it, and maybe get some interaction from some other people too who are trying to appreciate some music.
Awesome.
All right, we'll talk again. All right, thanks so much, Alex.
You got it. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.